When comparing our current Bitcoin cycle to previous ones, the data is suggesting that our bull market will top out within the next 3 months. Is this likely, or can we see evidence that this time really is different for BTC? So let's get right into it here on the BTC growth since cycle lows chart we have here on BitcoinMagazinePro.com. Now what we can see, this black line here is indicating our current Bitcoin cycle. What we can see as I film this, we're 971 days into the cycle. And what we can see looking at the previous two cycles, so the 2018 to 2022 in purple and the 2015 to 2018 in blue here, we can see that the 2017 cycle topped out 1,068 days within the cycle, and the 2021 cycle topped out 1,059 days into the cycle. So we can see we're 971 days in. That would indicate if we are to continue following the path of these two previous cycles, which so far we're following it pretty nicely, that would indicate that Bitcoin is likely to top out in less than 100 days. In fact, less than 3 months' time. We can see that if we go to the TradingView chart here, what I've done is align the previous two cycles price action over this current cycle from the lowest closing price we had. And I've just assumed that they're both going to run up to $200,000. So the prices are arbitrary. We're more focusing on the time in this analysis here. What I can do is if I just zoom in, we can see that this current cycle has actually been outpacing the previous two cycles when we scale them down for a vast majority of the time. But we can see here, if we just zoom in, that around this stage within the previous two cycles, Bitcoin has entered this banana zone where we've gone pretty much exponential in price action all the way up to new all-time highs. And what we can see is if we are to continue doing this, if we just take the average of the previous two cycles, right in the middle of there, we can see that this current cycle would be due to top out on October 19th of this year. So less than 3 months away. Now, of course, everyone is looking to a few different factors to say that this maybe isn't going to be the case this cycle. We just go back to Bitcoin Magazine Pro here. What we can see is people are looking towards the ETF buyers and thinking these are buying millions of Bitcoin, literally around 1.2 million Bitcoin being held by the new ETFs in a relatively short space of time since January of last year. This is a monumental amount of Bitcoin that's been accumulated. And a lot of people are thinking that a huge amount of this Bitcoin might not hit the open market again. That changes the supply and demand economics of the network, which of course it does. Keep in mind that this isn't all institutional buying. Of course, a lot of this will be made up by institutions accumulating through the ETFs, but a vast majority of this will probably just be high net worth individuals buying through BlackRock or something. What we can see is Bitcoin treasury companies, something that's really taken off this cycle, have already accumulated over $100 billion of Bitcoin, 870,000 and other 4% of the circulating supply. And every single day, it seems, there's thousands more Bitcoin being accumulated by these treasury companies. And along with that, of course, there's countries that are holding Bitcoin. We can see the US currently holding over 200,000 Bitcoin, El Salvador buying every single week, or is it every single day? We can see that this is roughly around 500,000. I think it's slightly over 520,000 Bitcoin-ish, but we'll just round that to around 500,000 Bitcoin, again, being held by countries that aren't looking to immediately dump it onto the open market. So if we add this together, 1.2 million, 800,000, we'll just round it, 2 million, 2.5 million. And again, if we look to something like the Bitcoin hodl waves, if I just remove all of them apart from the 10 years, so the Bitcoin that hasn't moved in over 10 years, we can see that this is 16.88% of the circulating supply of Bitcoin. Now, of course, not all of these will be lost. We just saw a few weeks ago someone who'd been holding for 14 years move over 80,000 Bitcoin. So again, we're just going to be super conservative here and just say, let's say half of these are lost Bitcoin. That gives us approximately, given the fact that the circulating supply is 19.8 million, there's 16.8, so around 3.3 million Bitcoin that's been held for over 10 years. Again, we'll just round that down, we'll half it, 1.5 million. If we aggregate all of this together, this is potentially 4 million Bitcoin that aren't likely to hit the open market anytime soon. Now, of course, the ETFs holders can sell. We're likely to see some treasury companies begin offloading during a bear cycle. But right now, potentially 20%, over 20% of the Bitcoin circulating supply is not readily available. Now, of course, that changes the supply and demand economics of the network. But is this time really different? Well, we just go back to TradingView here. I have to really reiterate, a lot of people maybe haven't been around in Bitcoin for multiple different cycles, but I would like to say this narrative has been around every single Bitcoin cycle. And I know people are going to dislike this, but in the previous cycle, we were seeing companies like Strategy begin to accumulate Bitcoin. But along with that, we were seeing exchanges like FTX. At the time, this seemed great. Them buying a huge quantity of cryptocurrencies, naming stadiums after them. We were getting huge funds like 3AC, Bitcoin management companies like Celsius, all buying up vast quantities of Bitcoin. And we were saying here, the supply and demand economics of the network are going to change. Yeah, we had, I won't say a typical cycle, a double top definitely wasn't expected by a majority, but we can definitely say that this was a fairly typical Bitcoin cycle. In terms of length, in terms of returns, it's fairly normal. In the 2017 cycle, again, it was very different. Now Bitcoin wasn't just some niche asset held by cypherpunks who were just trading on the dark web. Now it was actually becoming mainstream. People were able to download Coinbase, buy Bitcoin on their phone, and suddenly it was becoming something that was in the news. We were breaking into five-figure territory, above $10,000 towards $20,000. Everyone thought that this time was different, and it wasn't. And I wasn't around in previous cycles, but I'm sure at this point people were saying, right, well, now we have a centralized exchange in Mt. Gox, so we don't have to use peer-to-peer transactions, and now we're seeing big institutions coming in to mine Bitcoin. We're not just all mining them on our at-home CPU rigs. Every single cycle, this time is different. I would love to be proven wrong. I really would love for this time to be different and see a Bitcoin super cycle and rally to exponential prices, $250,000, $500,000, even higher. But until we see data back that up, that is speculation. As much as you might think, no, but this time is different. We have data to show that the ETFs are buying and huge corporations are buying and the amount of Bitcoin being held by long-term holders continues. I know. Every single cycle, something is different, but the more things change, the more things have stayed the same. Until we see evidence that that is actually happening, this is our base case. We have to assume that Bitcoin is going to track the previous two cycles, at least loosely. Of course, it's not going to be exactly October 19th. Well, almost certainly not. If it is, I'm going to gloat and say I'm a genius. I knew everything that was going to happen. If we just go back to Bitcoin Magazine Pro here, what we can see is if we just go to the monthly returns heat map, typically we see during Bitcoin bull markets, Q4 being by far the best performing period for Bitcoin. We can see in 2017, we had 3 months of massive exponential gains. In 2020, I know that wasn't exactly the market peak, but it was where we set our first top or first big run up in the Bitcoin price action. Again, monumental gains. Even in 2023, we had massive gains. Even last year, of course, we had a red December, but that November was massive, nearly 40% returns. So even though this is pointing towards October 19th, my personal opinion is it wouldn't surprise me if we do extend slightly beyond that into potentially November, December time, even early Q1 2026. But until we have data to back it up that this time is different, we are extending, we are seeing the new inflows propping the Bitcoin price up, minimizing drawdowns, and really overextending the upside potential of this cycle. That has to be our base case. It has to be. I'd love to be proven wrong, like I said. But is this even a possibility? Could we actually see Bitcoin have this big banana zone and top out in the next 3 months? Because a lot of people maybe forget that if we just go really quickly back to TradingView here, in the 2017 cycle, of course, it looks great, very typical, amazing cycle. We could do a big exponential run like this. It'd be amazing. What we can see is when Bitcoin first crossed $10,000, it only took 2 weeks to get to near $20,000. Once we get into this banana zone, things get crazy really quickly. So even though we're currently at $120-ish thousand, and people are saying, yeah, but we're not going to run up to however high you might think we can go. Let's just say $200,000 for a random number. Are we really going to do that? Even in this cycle already, if we just look back to when we had this run up to over $100,000, we can see at this point here, it was less than 100 days for Bitcoin to do, well, around 100 days, nearly 100%. When we had the run up post ETF announcement here, we can see Bitcoin did 80+% in 50 days. When Bitcoin gets going, it really builds up some momentum. It's really hard to slow it down. So could we top out in the next 100 days after a big exponential run up? Of course. And if we look at something like the global M2 money supply, we can see that this is definitely still on a big macro uptrend. We have a slight contraction in the rate of acceleration to the upside in global liquidity, but we can see this trend is definitely to the upside. The bull market definitely looks to be on in terms of a macroeconomic perspective. And looking at on-chain data, again, we can see we still have massive upside potential remaining. But again, if we look at the previous cycles, we can see here, when we're at a similar level in the 2020-2021 cycle, we were, let's say we're right now at about 2.6, 2.7. So let's say right around here, December 10th, 2020, it was only about 2 months later that Bitcoin hit an MVRVZ score above 7 into this upper red sell zone, and price had gone from, this is in market cap, but just about $20,000 to over $60,000. In 2017, something very similar. We were down here, September 14th, 2017. We had a Z score even lower of 2.37. And again, in less than 3 months, Bitcoin was up here, up towards $20,000, and the Z score had far surpassed values of even 10, which again just shows how quickly things can shift in this market. And one other thing that I've noticed recently, which again, I don't want to say is signaling that we're into this big banana zone or that I think it's going to play out. If we look at the 200 weekly moving average for Bitcoin, we can see that this has recently surpassed $50,000, which is a monumental achievement and is really hopefully going to provide some generational buying pressure and support if we are to have a Bitcoin bear market and maybe retrace levels this low. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen, but if we do, it's good to see that the 200 weekly moving average has surpassed $50,000. Again, it just really outlines the strength and maturity of this market. But if we look to the Bitcoin realized price, the average accumulation price, the cost basis for all investors on the network, we can see that again, this has recently surpassed $50,000. Both of them have converged and actually crossed over. If I go back to TradingView here, what we can do is if I just hide these two patterns here and add on this line and these two lines. The orange line is the realized price. This blue line changing color here is the 200 weekly moving average. Only once in the entire history of Bitcoin has the realized price crossed above the 200 weekly moving average. And that occurred, if I just change this back onto a candle chart here, on the 21st of November, 2020. Now what I can do is if I just grab the percentage tool here, in the following 90 days, well, we'll just say 92 days, from that cross occurring, Bitcoin ran up 212% in 3 months. About how much time we have left in this cycle according to the previous two cycles in their time. Again, I don't necessarily think that's exactly going to happen. I could see as personally extended beyond that, but this has to be our base case. When this cross occurred, Bitcoin had a 200% increase when the price was only about 18,000 all the way up to the price nearly reaching $60,000. If I just scroll across here, we can see a couple days ago, we once again had this cross occurring, and it occurred on, if I just draw that, the 15th of July. So a little while ago now, but if I just draw something on, and even if we only get half of what we got in the previous cycle, if I just draw this up here, if we only get 105%, I say only 105% like it's nothing. But we can see in this cycle already, Bitcoin has had these big exponential run-ups in a very short space of time, like we had when we surpassed $100,000, like we had when we first reached $74,000-ish post ETF announcement. This lost in my words. This would result in a Bitcoin price of around $250,000 by October 19th, following almost the exact same track we had in the previous cycle, accounting for diminishing returns. I know this is all speculation, and I said don't speculate, but it's more fun to do this way. We can see that this is a genuine, realistic, potential outcome for Bitcoin over the coming months. Now, I know people are expecting a summer lull, people are expecting a very positive Q4. Again, if we see this data breaking, if we see a shift in the supply and demand economics on the network for a sustained period of time, if we see all these data points pointing towards lengthening cycles, potentially not even diminishing returns, then of course, that's what we need to do. But does this Bitcoin cycle have less than 100 days remaining? As much as I personally don't think so, we have to assume that this is our base case, just purely going off the data. Also, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the charts discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your number one source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, looking at the previous two Bitcoin cycles, if we are to follow a similar path to a bull market peak, then this cycle would top out around 19th of October this year, so in less than 3 months' time. However, what we can see is looking at metrics such as the MVRVZ score, we can see it's entirely reasonable to go from our current level of overextension to the upside to bull. Didn't write that very well, did I? You kind of get the gist of what I'm saying here. And what we can also see is in the previous cycle already, man, it's been a long morning. We can see we've already had big run-ups towards $74,000, towards above $100,000 in a very similar space of time, if not a short space of time, for similar percentage returns. And what we can also see looking at that 200 weekly moving average and realized price crossing over, as much as I don't think that that's going to play out, it is an interesting thing to note. And again, just outlines when we are entering this banana exponential zone of Bitcoin bull market anything is really possible. Looking at 2017, it was only 2 weeks for us to double in price. So when we really get this big influx of retail FOMO, when we see institutions piling in, don't want to miss out on this Bitcoin corporation, massive exponential returns and increases in share prices, if we get a Bitcoin strategic reserve, then who knows how high we can go. And especially looking towards Q4, which has historically been the strongest for Bitcoin, I think we might slightly extend this into potentially November, December, maybe even Q1 of 2026. But this is speculation. We need to react to what the data is telling us to do. We can't get sucked into the this time is different narrative, as much as this time might be different. And I really sincerely would love, in a year's time, for everyone to look back at this and laugh at me and point and say, oh, I can't believe you didn't think this time was really different. This is the super cycle. I would love for that to happen. But if we are assuming that is going to happen, we're speculating. We're not relying on data and fact. We're not relying on what has historically been the norm. And we are just assuming that things are going to change this cycle, which, as I said, isn't reliable, isn't accurate, isn't based on data. So I would love this time to be different. But right now, we have to assume our base case is Bitcoin topping out in Q4 of this year. If you like this video, then please visit bitcoinmagazinepro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are on Bitcoin potentially topping out in October of this year. Do you think that that's a realistic possibility? I know people are going to be in the comments saying, oh my God, how don't you think it's topping out in November or September or January or something? And they'll post some crazy fractals or waves or moon cycles or something to prove how wrong I am. Fair enough. Whatever you think is going to happen, stick to that. But all I'm trying to do is relay what the data is telling me and what the historical facts and data are pointing towards. And to me, that looks like Q4 topping out is definitely our base case. And right now, the most probable scenario for Bitcoin. But as I said, let me know your thoughts below in the comments and on social media, because I do look forward to reading and replying to, I won't say all of them, but most of them are usually pretty civilized and nice. And of course, as always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.